So hello and welcome to another edition of Peace Talks. Today we're going to be discussing Chinese approaches to conflict management and how they fit within sort of broader Asian approaches to conflict management. Peace Talks are webinars organized by the consortium, PeaceRep consortium. And for those of you unfamiliar with us, PeaceRep is a research consortium funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And our main ambition is to rethink peace and transition processes in light of changing conflict dynamics. It involves a number of universities, NGOs, and independent consultants, experts on a number of different peace processes around the world. So we are organizing this particular webinar on Chinese approaches to conflict management under a research stream, which we started last year called Global Transitions. This is our work looking at fragmentations of the global order and how these impact peace and transition management. And as the first stage of the project, we were looking at sort of how different non-Western or sort of emergent powers are approaching conflicts in various regions of the world. My name is Mateja Peter, and joining me today are two world-renowned experts. I can genuinely say that are participating in the PeaceRep consortium. Bernardo Mariani, who is an independent consultant on the consortium, and Monalisa Adhikari from Keele University. Both of them are authors of reports that have been published on our website already. So Bernardo wrote a very comprehensive report on Chinese approaches to peacemaking, peacebuilding, broader conflict management, looking in particular about to how China has been approaching conflicts in Africa and Middle East. And Monalisa Adhikari is an author of our report on broader Asian approaches, comparing Chinese approaches to Japan, India, and her expertise lies particularly in approaches of Asian countries in Asia itself. So they will be sharing comments with us. I asked them to sort of focus their comments on sort of broader findings that they have, but also to perhaps give us an insight on how China might become a player in sort of the Ukraine conflict. And I would encourage you to read their reports if you are interested to know more, because they're really comprehensive and they will give you much more than in their 10 to 12 minute inputs at the beginning. So in terms of housekeeping, we are recording this first part of the conversation because we actually have quite a lot of people that have contacted us that the lunchtime webinar is not a particularly good time for them. And so we want to share their expertise with other audience. But don't worry, the questions and answer session will be kept off the recording. So I would encourage everybody to help me moderate the debate further on. If you have any questions for both of them, type it up in the chat box at the site as we go, and we can raise it in a discussion. I will be moderating those questions, but if you have accessibility questions which prevent you from typing, do let us know and we will unmute you so you can ask the question directly. So that is it for me. I will pass the floor to Bernardo, who will introduce us to sort of his thinking about how China is approaching conflict management today. The floor is yours, Bernardo.
And many thanks to everyone for joining us. As we all know, over the past 2 decades, China has increased its presence and influence in many countries around the world that are affected by conflict. It has tried to reconcile old foreign policy principles, especially those of non-interference and state sovereignty, with a new need to ensure the safety of Chinese assets and Chinese nationals, and with the international demands placed on China's global role. China has increasingly engaged in crisis diplomacy, mediation, UN peace operations and post-conflict reconstruction in a number of countries. In Afghanistan, Congo DRC, Mali, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Sudan, South Sudan, Myanmar, just to mention a few. The main factor driving China's engagement in conflict settings is China's own economic development and trade needs. There are other drivers, of course, including internal security concerns, geopolitics, the responsibility to protect Chinese citizens working abroad, and these drivers may acquire more prominence in specific context, especially in China's periphery. But on the whole, I believe that China's main motivation in regions of conflict and instability is its own development, connectivity, and trade needs. So once it operates in a conflict-affected context, China seeks mainly stability rather than actively pursuing peace, especially in places where it has financial and geostrategic interests. The concepts of peacemaking and peace building are not fully accepted at the official level in China, are rarely found in speeches delivered by Chinese officials. Across Africa and Asia, we see China articulating a specific vision of how to engage in conflict areas. First of all, the early stages of nation building from a Chinese perspective require stability. So in a sense, this is the outward projection of China's own experiences, China's own domestic experiences. So from this perspective, any early focus on social transformation, human rights, good governance is seen from a Chinese perspective as premature, even a hindrance, in fact, to the aim of securing stability, which is in itself dependent on a competent and strong authority. Secondly, in contrast to Western-led liberal peace concepts, with their focus on good governance, the protection of civil and political rights, the Chinese developmental peace concept considers economic development as the crucial precondition of a sustainable internal peace. Thirdly, the multipolar world order. So China is committed to a multipolar world order is one in which an increasing number of countries are connected more strongly to China and are supportive of Chinese national interests. That crosses over into how China views Western powers and their interventions as the cause of instability in Africa, the Middle East, and other regions. Fourthly, China has a historic distaste, let's call it, for sanctions and other restrictive measures and punishments, which it considers equivalent to interference in other countries' domestic affairs. It favors instead persuasion, compromise. In the UN Security Council, it has often aligned with Russia in vetoing resolutions imposing sanctions. The closer that fragile countries are to China, the more important economic and security factors are to Beijing, the more willing China is to use its influence and to adopt a more interventionist type of approach. This intervention is often through special envoys or by setting the table for peace talks. The concern that instability in neighboring countries may spill over into its territory, so in particular, the provinces of Xinjiang and Yunnan, has led China to take a more proactive role in its periphery. And generally speaking, the situation in the Korean Peninsula, in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, are of much greater concern to China in comparison to conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. I want to touch upon the war in Ukraine because I think it's not possible to insulate the discourse around international peacemaking and peace building from the global implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The increased food and energy insecurity is having dire consequences especially for low-income countries that were already weakened by the pandemic and climate change, and is potentially fueling now more divisions, more tensions in places where peace is at best fragile, if not non-existent. Security and political priorities are shifting around the world, and China's approaches to conflict management may also shift. We know that in recent years, the rising tensions with the US have driven Moscow and Beijing closer together. Just weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping declared that their country's partnership had no limits. There have been misperceptions and miscalculations by Russia before it started the war. Like Russia, China expected a quick Russian offensive followed by a Ukrainian surrender. This would have damaged the credibility of the US and NATO countries. It would have strengthened the China-Russia partnership. However, things have not gone according to plan, and the conflict drags on, and it has raised the stakes for China. The US is doubling down in the Indo-Pacific region. Europe is seeing the impact of its dependence on Russian oil and gas and is increasingly worried about dependence on the Chinese market and supply chains. Was already worried before, even more so now. In China, soaring food and energy prices are slowing down economic growth. All these negative factors are testing how unlimited the partnership with Russia really is. Since the beginning of the war, China has tried to portray itself as a neutral actor, calling for peace while simultaneously blaming the US. It has refused to condemn Russia, and Chinese media have amplified Russian propaganda. At the same time, though, China has not provided material support to its most important strategic partner, Russia. In particular, it has not helped Russia circumvent international sanctions. A kind of a balancing act there. But as the conflict in Ukraine continues, this balancing act is going to get progressively more difficult. There have been, as we know, international calls for China to use its influence to mediate a cessation of the hostilities. Yeah, it has to be seen whether China will eventually rise to the occasion. Many see it as unlikely. However, China's crisis diplomacy and mediation history also offer some options for a potential role in Ukraine. Many predictions about Ukraine and the war there have proved to be wrong, so I would not discard the possibility of an increase of a role of China, basically, of a mediation role of China in Ukraine. I'll move to some conclusions. So China has a vision of its role in global governance, which aims to make the international environment more amenable to China's governance model and to Chinese national interests. In pursuing this vision, China pushes for its developmental peace model that challenges Western peacemaking and peace building insofar as economic development stability initiatives take much higher priority over promotion of good governance, rule of law, democracy, respect of civil and political rights. I don't believe that China is trying to impose its governance system onto other countries. However, China promotes a kind of Chinese solutions discourse, which revolves around the superiority of the Chinese model, its effectiveness at achieving stability or greater effectiveness at achieving stability compared to Western countries, and its applicability in other settings. So without force or coercion, I would say that China promotes and soft sells its model. The lack of historical baggage that China has, the ability it has to mobilize quite significant economic resources and the ability to implement ambitious programs, especially infrastructure programs, allow China to find many supporters in Africa and other regions. But China also faces a range of challenges that I think will inevitably push it to adopt an incremental approach for implementing its vision and implementing its strategies. Despite looking like a monolithic block to many, especially in this part of the world, a number of different actors, Chinese actors, engage at different levels in conflict and post-conflict societies and are at times divided by competing interests. China is a relatively newcomer to it's a relatively new global peace and security actor. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has limited resources, specific expertise on, for example, China and the Middle East is underdeveloped, and conflict management is still a new discipline in China. And last but not least, COVID. So China has basically cut itself off from the rest of the world because of COVID, and now faces the hard challenge of when and how to reopen. So these are quite big challenges, but still, despite these challenges, China remains the main driver of global growth. And with the changing world order, it will likely become more involved in countries where peace is fragile or non-existent. So putting geopolitics aside and from a pure peace building perspective, there is a need, I believe, to continue to seek to find common ground for cooperation between the West and China, common ground that will help to better safeguard the interests of both, and most of all, the lives of the millions of people at the receiving end of conflict and instability around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative provides a potential common ground, a potential confluence of interests. Why? Because China is investing a great deal of money and political capital in the initiative, which has a transformative potential for conflict environments where Western countries are often also engaged. For China, the business viability of the BRI is linked to greater peace and stability in the countries it passes through. So to me, this suggests a need to continue to study how this initiative is transforming conflict environments, either positively or negatively, and to put forward practical suggestions for Chinese, Western, and local actors on the best ways to achieve a better coordination between them that helps to build sustainable peace. I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. These were really comprehensive comments. I would encourage anybody who was inspired by Bernardo's remarks and has any thoughts on sort of follow-up or questions to do so in the chat room. I have plenty of questions already, but before we open up to Q&A, I'll pass it to Monalisa Adhikari, who is, for those of us joining us only now, our expert on sort of broader Asian approaches to conflict management, but has also done sort of substantive work in Myanmar and in Nepal, sort of analyzing sort of very much ground level developments and how different Asian countries approach them. Mona.
Thank you, Mateja. Very nice to see so many friends and colleagues, and a pleasure to be here. So I'll follow back with Bernardo. Bernardo's outlined how China speaks a very distinct vernacular of peace, which is focused on stability, development, strong state institutions, and has varying motivations, largely guided by its economic interests. So I think I'll take that framework forward, and I'd seek to do three things in the next 10-15 minutes. First, I'd look at what are the challenges of neatly establishing or outlining patterns of Chinese engagement. In the sense, what does these features of Chinese engagement, what can be the intervening variables that guide China's engagement? And second, I'd also seek to sort of locate China within a larger body of Asian actors doing international peace building work, focusing largely on Japan and India. And lastly, I'll just conclude by saying, what does this mean for, what does this Chinese model of peace building, if you like, mean for both the praxis and the scholarship of peace building? So to start, I'll look at what are the challenges or intervening variables that sort of somehow determine and perhaps that we're not sufficiently looking at. So for one, Bernardo talked a bit about it, that there is no one uniform China. There are multiple actors, state-led, private, provinces, different forms of state agencies working in different aspects in conflict-affected states, and often working cross purposes and directly and indirectly impacting different dimensions of peace processes, their conflict patterns, etc. And this is perhaps more in the regional periphery, where there's more cross-border trade, aid, flow of arms, etc. But this also has a wider implication in peace building beyond the region as well. And of course, there have been the various frameworks to explain this absence of uniformity, or how international relations, at least as a discipline, should go beyond looking at this, looking China as a homogeneous, monolithic actor. So there are ideas about pluralization of Chinese foreign policy, or the fact that as China has risen, it's been marked by sheer growth in number of actors who have designed and delivered its foreign policy, which would mean that many state, non-state actors through formal and informal channels have influenced conflict processes across the border, or in other words, the governance frontier of Chinese domestic politics has somehow has been internationalized. And there's also ideas about street transformation, or the fact that as China has risen, it has become much more fragmented as a country, where many powerful central agencies have dispersed power to different other multiple agencies. It's become much more decentralized in terms of the control over its policy and resources. And it's become much more internationalized in the sense that there are many domestic agencies which now have a very international role and function. So I think if you bring insights, all of that into the study of peace building and peace processes, and also there's a mounting evidence on the ground that all of these have impacted peace processes and peace building in countries like, at least in the near periphery, like Myanmar and Nepal. So for instance, in Myanmar, when I was doing my fieldwork, one of the biggest debates was, is the flow of arms, flow of trade, which somehow had skewed the center-periphery relations, which was so core to the peace process in Nepal. Is it a Beijing policy, or is it just Yunnan, one of the provinces? So how do we understand this dynamics on the ground? So I think that is one of the variables that we should be looking more into. The second is also, when we look at peace processes, peace building, we're really looking at mediation, elements of peace agreements, projects like transitional justice, human rights, etc. But one of the things that the Chinese engagement or case of China highlights is that its wider engagement through trade, investments, security partnerships have indirectly but very intensely impacted core debates of the peace process. And Belt and Road Initiative, because of its largest nature, is perhaps an emblematic of the wider trend. And so, for instance, in Myanmar, Belt and Road, to protect investments as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the military had stationed a lot of soldiers in various ethnic regions. And this was at a time in the peace process where people were really talking about demilitarization, about security sector reform. So you did see that things like Belt and Road Initiative were intersecting with various elements of the peace process and reducing the trust that people had on the peace process. And this also means that when we look at peace processes, we need to sort of change our perspective about how do we categorize, but also how do we study international intervention. So perhaps Belt and Road Initiative or economic flows and trade and investments have not usually been taken as variables. But these are one of the things that Chinese engagement evidences, is that we need to look beyond the confines of peace processes to look at wider political economy and how that impacts cross-border political economy and how that impacts fundamental debates on the peace process. And the third factor that works as an intervening variable, which challenges how we study or how we attempt to tease out features of Chinese engagement, is also the fact that it's not static and it's evolving. And it's evolving as a result of its changing domestic and international priorities. Bernardo talked about the need of securing stability in some of these fragile frontiers, if you like, but it's also changing and evolving in relation to this landscape of conflict-affected states. So whenever we discuss China's relationship with different conflict-affected states or developing countries in general, I feel that there is a lot that we focus so much on China that we somehow overlook the agency of these states. But we know that the dynamics of conflict-affected states have also led to changes in fundamental practices of China's diplomacy. And for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative in Myanmar, there's been a lot of backlash against Chinese investments historically, but more so since 2011 onwards, when the civil society space opened up. And one of the things that China has done remarkably well is to sort of attune their investments. There was a time when Chinese in the peace process where Chinese investments going to different parts of the country didn't only need to have sign off from the central government, but also had to have sign off from local governments as well. So of course the practice could be debated, and there are a lot of gaps in sort of practicing these. But this also evidences how China's approach has been evolving in relation to the landscape of conflict-affected states. But China's approach has also been evolving based on the geostrategic competition that we see, especially in Asia. And Bernardo highlighted some of that, so I won't quite get into detail, but just to sum up that it becomes difficult to sort of delineate Chinese approach because it's not static and it's evolving. But beyond direct engagement, I also wanted to shed light on or talk about the normative implications of China. And here, China is not soft selling or hard selling its example, but there are conflict-affected states that look at China that look at China as a normative or an institutional benchmark. So, of course, there is this growing body of work around authoritarian constitutional borrowing, etc. But what I really wanted to sort of focus on is not China somehow soft selling or hard selling, but where China's ideas about human rights, China's ideas about institutions and how power is shared between different provinces and the center have become examples for different conflict-affected states, and I'll come back to one of those examples later. So I think the second thing that I wanted to touch upon in the presentation was also how does China compare to other Asian states? And of course, there are similarities about how elements of developmental peace, ideas about stability, as well as a promotion of a very state-centric approach is a shared premise of with other Asian countries like India and Japan. But there are differences, and I think one of the fundamental is the geographic focus. So patterns of Chinese aid highlight that the highest volume goes to Africa, But for India, it's centered very much in its immediate region in South Asia. And similarly for Japan, despite growing engagement now in Africa, the focus historically has been on Asia, and notably East Asia, Southeast Asia. But also there are very different institutional models that different conflict-affected states want to emulate. And here I'd just give an example of India and China. So in Myanmar, there were different ethnic armed organizations who were all campaigning for different ideas of federalism. So one of the sticking points throughout the peace process was what should be that federal model, or how should federalism in Myanmar look like? So there were many ethnic armed organizations that looked at India with its provinces that had political, social, a lot of political and social power. It was based on language differences, linguistic diversity, etc. But there were also ethnic armed organizations like the United Raw State Army, who wanted to emulate China's institutional model, which was largely about provinces having a lot of economic power, but not so much political. So there are various institutional models that they differ on the institutional models that different conflict-affected states want to emulate. But I think one of the key is of the other differences is also the very rise of China, as well as the perceptions of China being a threat, is a shared premise that binds India and China, often against India. And notably, it has implications to conflict-affected states. So for instance, there have been discussions about Japan and India having joint partnerships on very select projects in Myanmar, especially in the Rakhine state, which has been deeply conflict affected and multiple vectors of conflict. And this also highlights that in Asia, geostrategic factors have a deep resonance on how ideas of conflict management and peace building play out. And of course, there are differences multilaterally as well, with China having a seat at the UN Security Council and being so central to global debates, not so much which India and Japan are sort of in the margins of. So, what does this mean? I'll just conclude by saying, what does this mean for the scholarship and praxis of peace building or peace studies as we know it? And so in peace studies, a lot of scholars put a lot of faith in alternative models that perhaps might fill the gap of or remedy the inefficiencies of liberal peace building programs and templates. One of the things that Chinese engagement and the unintended consequences of Chinese engagement, especially in countries like Myanmar, which has been said to be centered very much on elites, focused on brokering stability, when the larger section of the population wants a much more sustainable idea of justice and peace, show that alternative models, especially coming from China, don't flare any better to liberal models as well. So I think that this it takes on to this fundamental idea of how alternative models might not be the solution, which for a long time in peace studies had been said to. Then there are other scholars who, especially in mainstream international relations, who highlight how China would revisit norms and forms of global governance, displace the current liberal mode of doing things. But while China is introducing new norms, there's no visible push to apply somehow these developmental templates or a Chinese way of doing things more explicitly in conflict-affected states. And of course, this has been a point of frustration. So, for instance, in Myanmar, a lot of stakeholders would think that Chinese engagement being very parochial, it's only linked to issues that were very important for Chinese interests, and it sort of overlooked long-term interests that perhaps were very critical for the peace process, but not so much for China's immediate economic and political or geostrategic interests. I'll just end by saying that amidst all these divergences and differences between the Chinese way of doing things and liberal peace model of doing things, there is at least one area of core convergence, and this is this idea of mediation and peacemaking. So China's idea of stability and brokering stability would mean that China has invested a lot of diplomatic and financial capital on mediating and facilitating conflicts, which would somehow avert at least the physical violence, if not broker long-term peace. And this is one area that has a shared premise with liberal peace builders. Of course, there are differences in the sense that peace builders would want to see ceasefires and the signing of peace agreements only as the first step to a much more long-term peace process. But I think the starting point, which is about peacemaking, is one of those areas of convergence, which could be harnessed as an area where there could be further cooperation. I'll just end that here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Mona. There's a lot to chew on again, and so many levels. So I do have a couple of questions coming in already, but given that both of you have raised kind of the idea that there is a convergence between sort of Western partners and sort of the Chinese model at one level, the way that Mona just ended sort of at the peacemaking stage, that there is kind of the idea for stability taking priority, but then the divergence might be happening at a later stage on sort of how to then kind of go about implementing sort of the peace building model. So Bernardo did mention at some point that he thinks that China is not trying to impose, that it's not a hard sell for this model. And it sounded that Mona, you agree with that, and it might be a bit more of a sort of softer way. What I'm wondering is if either of you has any examples or thoughts on how attractive the model is. Is it gaining traction in these countries? If it is not sort of a hard sell that comes with conditions, is it then that it's more attractive than the idea of sort of the liberal peace model? Bernardo, should we give you space now so that Mona has a bit of a breather?
No, thanks. Well, if we look, for example, at Africa, it's a continent where, China has been very engaged in different shapes and forms. And if we look at perceptions of China and Chinese engagement by Africans, by African people, those perceptions tend to be rather positive, in fact, with varying degrees, obviously, and ups and downs because of COVID and vaccines, etc. But by and large, the image of China in Africa is positive. The attractiveness is due to a number of factors there. So on the one hand, there's the historical baggage or the lack of it, let's say. So the commonalities there of China and African countries have, in the course of their history, suffered from colonization. And the fact that China can operate more as a neutral type of actor, that is attractive. That's the economic engagement, obviously, and the new opportunities created by that engagement in terms of infrastructure development, minerals extraction, etc. An economic engagement that comes with not so many conditions attached to it. I wouldn't say that it comes with no condition whatsoever attached to it, because as we have seen, especially in recent years, the condition that China is placing basically to its investments in Africa is, what are the risks, how to minimize risks, which is, a condition, let's say, in itself. But generally speaking, there are no conditions in terms of governance, of respect for civil and political rights, and that's for the incumbent regimes in Africa, wherever they are, that is attractive in itself. And also the attractiveness of China as a becoming more of a security actor also in Africa, where it has deployed many peacekeepers. Most of the Chinese peacekeeping forces are in Africa, and the fact that in some contexts it has, I would say it has achieved to break the deadlock. So this is one of the questions that I've seen, in the chats. So does China have potential to help breaking deadlocks? Well, yes, if it if it decides to invest in it, it does have that potential. And in places like Sudan and South Sudan, for example, it did help to break deadlocks and work towards peace agreements, ceasefires, etc.
Right, great. Thanks so much, Bernardo. Mona, to you about kind of the attractiveness of the Chinese peace building model. I know you've worked a lot on this.
Yes, I do think there is some sense of attractiveness, but I would think that it is very limited as well, at least in the region. So I'll just give you an example. So as the Nepali peace process was ending, the Prime Minister, I think it was 2017 or 18, articulated his vision of democracy. Note that Nepal's peace process was very comprehensive with values of democracy, long-term transformation very much built into the process. And in his vision for democracy, it was very much about right to life being central to democracy. So it resonated to very Chinese ideas about articulations of human rights where social and economic rights took precedence over political rights. And we've seen various articulations of those of similar resonance resonate throughout by different political leaders, etc. But I do think that this has an instrumental value in a sense that when you're really trying to navigate your way through Western dominance, or you're trying to get benefits from Western aid, etc., it helps to have that it helps to have or be able to leverage this distinct Chinese form of understanding the world at an instrumental level. But know that I think there are many, at least in South Asia, there is societal demands for better democracy, etc. There is a historically, there's been very vibrant democratic movements, etc. So there are limits as to how the elites would want to broker or talk about attractiveness of Chinese values. But I think I'll just end by saying that it's not always illiberal as well. So there are very small pockets of very liberal, I think, examples where China, that conflict-affected states can emulate. So, for instance, one of the examples in Kachin State that people would talk about is how in Jingpo province in China, the Jingpo prefecture in China, minority languages are used for signposting on the roads, etc. And for the Kachins, it's something that they want to emulate because their movement for greater autonomy has been very much centered around cultural rights. And you could say similar things about minorities getting preferential treatment, etc. as well. So I wouldn't class everything as illiberal. I'll just end that here. Thank you.